I'm sure that there's an element of defeatism to my bearing in this today. Just somewhat of a bleary day. But I wanted to address the question of what it feels like to be of a generation that was caught between Donald Trump and Martin Luther King. Being 61 years old and coming into awareness during the early 60s. I was born in 1960. Uh, Coming into a full senior citizenship status within the last couple of years. I saw the breadth of time, but in addition to the events that unfolded, I felt the change is going on as a result of cultural change and forces, as well as educational leanings. And I know what sort of influences developed and what sort of assumptions were in place that enculturated both these two men and their followers. And when you look at something like Bertolt Brecht's play Man is Man, or a song like I Am the Walrus, you're forced to or asked to um, imagine what it might take to make one person the other person. And even though for some people self review is impossible for some reason, as Martha Gellhorn said, racism, if it's incurable, has to be restrained by law. That's an example. There's still an element of creative pondering about the question of what makes people who are so different the same species. It makes it very difficult to accept that you're part of the same species as some people, just as there are probably some people who wish that you were different and might use persuasion or cajolery, coercion, force, bribery, rewards, friendship to influence you one way or another. But to give credence to people who are very different because of the fact that there's a sizable number of Americans who admire them. Is to ask yourself to accept a certain amount of hypocrisy in the name of compromise. That can be easier for some people to do than others. It doesn't take much imagination to see how Martin Luther King would regard what's happening today. He was a man who believed that the worst things that racism did were not just exclusion from children's fun parks, not just the harrowing and remorseless self image problems that developed in children subject to strange constructions that led to self denigration. And he realized how terrible those things were. Dedicated his life to undoing the damage and shoring people up and bringing about constructive social change. But his heart went out to the masses in the world. He was one of those people who believed in human rights, and he saw hunger disproportionately visited on people who were excluded from social progress and cheated by social programs that were inadequate to remedy the problems left by institutional racism. For example, he was against the war in Vietnam for legitimate moral reasons. He felt that what Ho Chi Minh had written and said stood out so strikingly as a genuine leader's concern for his people that he couldn't dismiss out of hand that we should be helping them, that they meant well by us. Shirley Chisholm, by contrast, also a black leader, simply regretted that the money was being taken for a census war that belonged in Head Start programs. So there was always a certain amount of charity beyond the civil rights movement in the heart of Martin Luther King. And for some people, I think that tendency is very inborn. We have people, my father, I like to remind people, had a book about human rights in the 1940s and led a Peace Corps chapter in Africa. But surely he's not alone. I mean, the 60s leadership crisis is the result of destruction of our leadership by killers. Left people without hope who had formerly been brimming over in spirit with hope. And cynicism set in. But there remain people who came to the world wanting to help other people, asking insistently, what are we doing about world hunger? What are we doing to help create medical communities in the third world who have access to the best diagnostics skills and tools and libraries, as well as to medicine and rehabilitation? I saw some of these people who were total strangers when I fell ill with what many suspect was COVID from before the testing was possible, who heard about me from the next door bulletin board and whose hearts went out to me, who brought me supplies. And such people fill the world. They ask no recognition. They're inborn with the spirit to try to remedy the world's inequities, who believe that people are born to live and thrive. But there's also a class of people who often are very intelligent themselves and work for self enrichment and argue that they provided things that are valuable to the world, and that's why they're in a position to be self enriched, and that it's just that fair that they should be enriched. And their arguments are always very interesting. I think that a certain caliber attaches to some of the arguments, except when they're selling the right to be destructive of others. And I think that's the pitch, that the difference between those of us who've been inconsolable from the loss of leadership that was provided by King, and in quite a state of disbelief, the rise of the alternative, the only available alternative in Donald Trump, is the idea that war is some kind of commodity to be exported, even if it means that it's someone else's war. The commodity has been exported to them, and they take possession of that commodity and go forth to do. People can be very tempestuous, and it can lead to misunderstanding, but for it to lead to hostilities and truly asinine behavior like we witnessed at the nuclear plant in the Ukraine suggests people who are damaged in leadership. And of course, it's harder to criticize Russia when you've lost a lot of faith in the United States. It's hard not to lose faith in the United States when you see the cunning and planning of mercenaries who are using access to weapons for domestic terror. When you understand what was lost when we lost Martin Luther King, and we have no right to just abandon ship with JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and many other important, influential people, some of whom are here today, gave us, is a legacy that we need to keep alive and build on. And in our search for common ground, we have to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of other people. See, what would I do if the shoe was on the other foot? What would I be willing to ask? Barry Goldwater earned my admiration and loyalty. Someone I didn't really care for, but I only knew him as that conservative with the big jaw who opposed JFK in an election. That's all I knew about him. He was from the ranks of the Republican extreme. He earned my respect and my loyalty when I saw how deeply wounded he was by the assassination of JFK. It was clear that here was a man who he loved, and who he loved to spar with and disagree with. But there's one thing that they held in common, was that the idea that prosperity without dignity was meaningless. I think that's the reason why the leadership that we have today on the far right is so very sad to me. people wonder, how can a person like you, whose condition is piteous, actually pity someone like you do the Trump family? The reason I pity them is that they've lost something when they became so prosperous that they no longer cared about dignity. I don't mean that to be cruel or insulting of anybody. It's just that I know better from long exposure to American letters than to actually believe that war as a commodity, as powerful as it has become, is the meaning and texture of American heritage. I disagreed with Bill Buckley about the Vietnam War and got some satisfaction out of seeing him angered by Noam Chomsky's retorts when the one occasion when they met and debated. But I also had to admit that he stood for something very important in the beauty of American newspaper industry, the protection of the right to controversial opinions. And I heard him speak out against Ayn Rand's callous chauvinism when it came to greed. I thought those were very redeeming points about Bill Buckley himself. And I admire the strength and energy that he brought to those issues. But more importantly, I realized that the whole program of American heritage, when it comes to conservative and liberal, is highly misrepresented by the Cold War establishment, by the idea that war is our last and most precious commodity for export. And I came to wonder why it was that more people weren't seeking answers on how to help during Arab Spring, which I understand was more complex than many people could get their minds around. But one of the reasons is because people have excluded that course of study. People from Britain were on TV the other day, statesmen, one of whom was accused of killing 1 million people in Iraq. And she just carried on about, and talk show host was carrying on about, basically it came over as Muslims being a cancer, which is a great indecency to call people who are as true and good and precious and meaningful to love and life and God as Muslims are, as though they're subhuman. To push a disgraceful idea of commodification and greed, which is warfare for profit, as though it can be legitimized as a profit-making industry, rather than abhorred as one. And I realized that there was something almost redeeming, as tragic and cruel as their lives are, in being aware that they're being dehumanized, because the American character is also being dehumanized, but people don't seem to be aware of it. That's what's so frustrating and frightening, leaves you so dead inside. It's the idea that it's not the ones who are openly espousing hate, but the ones that don't care at all. The ones that leave you walking wounded, unable to fully grasp something, because they've disenfranchised idealism and dignity, the search for higher principles. And it's a great strain. I think that's what it means to be caught between the leadership of Martin Luther King and Donald Trump. It's asking where do we go from here and feeling like there's nowhere left to turn. There's nowhere left to look for help.